Kia ora everybody. I'm going to read to you from the second part of Standing Stone from the book Torres Strait Heroes. And I thought before I started I might just show you a tapa cloth picture of Ha'amonga, the Tongan standing stones. And you can see that Ha'amonga has got two massive rocks that stand up flat on the ground, but they've got these little spaces to put the rock in that lies above, so there's no concrete, no nailing, nothing like that. They just cut into the top of the rock and put the third rock. So this is a trilithon. It's a three-piece stone structure. And it's called Ha'amonga, and it's in Tonga. So I thought I would just show you that before we get started with part two. Also, at the beginning of part two, you'll notice that there's a book, and it kind of looks like the book is flying. And on top of the book, on the cover, it says "Stories of Old," and so that's something that will come up soon in this part two. Okay, and if I stop and sip tea every now and then, it's because I get a bit of a croaky voice sometimes. Okay, here we go. Part two, the challenge. That afternoon, Mr. Withany gave Louis more cake and handed him a big jug of water to take outside with him. He told him to keep cutting back the bushes and to stop when he'd had enough. When Louis asked if three of his friends could come to have a look at men here, he smiled. "Of course they can," he said. "They're welcome, Louis, and bring them in for a piece of cake. It'll go stale if we don't eat it all up soon." Louis hadn't done much work before he heard Jack's voice outside. Climbing down the ladder, he placed the clippers on the grass beside it and made his way up the pebbly path to the gate. He smiled at the sight of Kuri, the dog, walking beside Bessie. Jack and Tim both spoke at once, asking if Mr. W had said yes. Louis nodded. Yeah, he said it was fine. He reached down to stroke Kuri's warm fur. "She wanted to come," Bessie said. "I couldn't leave her behind." "As long as she keeps away from Big Boss, Mr. W's cat, she'll be fine," Louis said, tickling Kuri under the chin. "Mr. W's got cake for you. We can have some later." "Only if it's better than what we've just eaten," Jack said. "We just ate some strange muffins that Aroha helped Mum make." Bessie laughed. "They weren't that bad," she said, following Louis down the path. They were sort of a mixture between a muffin and a stone," Tim said. They laughed. "It's true," Tim said. "Even Kuri didn't want one." Louis stopped. "This is men here." The four friends stared at the standing stone. "It's bigger than I thought it'd be," Jack said. "Can I pull the ladder over and look at the writing on the tip?" Bessie said. "Yep," Louis said. He helped her pull the ladder in front of the huge rock. "Climb up, Bessie." Bessie slowly read out the words, just as Louis had the day before. "If thou hast hand for opening, the sun's light make it possible." She ran her hand over the words, but nothing happened. Jack climbed up next, followed by Tim. "So the sunlight makes it possible," Tim called. Louis nodded. "The sun's out and it's on the rock now." "But not on the tip," Bessie said. "The bush is blocking it." "Won't take long for the sun to reach the tip," Tim said. "It's nearly there." "But what about the hand for opening?" Louis asked. "What does that mean?" "Well, let's find out," Jack said. "When the sun's on the tip, let's take turns at putting our hands on the rock and seeing what happens." They watched the sunlight spread to the tip of the rock. Soon each word was bathed in sunlight. "Who's putting their hand on it first?" Louis asked. "I will," Jack said. He stepped up to the front of the rock and placed his fingers on its rough surface. Bit by bit, he lowered his whole hand onto the rock. Nothing happened. Jack's mouth curled up in disappointment. I haven't got the hand for opening, he said. I really wanted something to happen. I'll try, Bessie said. She placed her whole hand on the rock. Everything stayed as it was, apart from Cloudbird swooping between plum blossoms on the trees behind them. Not me, Bessie said. Who's next? Tim stepped forward and put his hand on the rock. Again, nothing happened. You try, Louis. Louis looked up at the tip of the rock. The writing glimmered in the sun. He stepped up to the rock and lifted his hand, which, as if pulled by a magnet, pressed onto the rock's rough surface. A tingling sensation crept through his hand and into his wrist. The rock trembled. Louis pulled his hand away, leaping back to join the others. What's... he began, but he didn't finish the sentence. Cootie, who'd been lying under a plum tree, stood up and growled. In front of them, the rock was splitting and opening. A thunderous sound grumbled from its insides. Beneath their feet, the ground shook. Louis and his friends backed away and watched from a distance behind a tree. Everything stopped as quickly as it had begun. The Toy Street kids looked at each other and then back at the narrow opening in the rock. The hand for opening, Tim whispered, looking at Louis. Louis nodded. His hand was still tingling. Beside him, Cootie had stopped growling and he stroked the back of her neck. Do we go in? Jack asked. No one spoke. Jack moved from behind the tree to the rock. He peered into the opening. I can't see anything in there. It's just sort of a round space with rock walls and a hole in the floor. He leant in further. No, it's not just a hole. It's a staircase that goes under the ground. Bessie looked at Louis. You should go in, she said. You have the hand for opening. Louis put his hand to his throat. The thought of stepping inside the rock made him feel like he couldn't swallow. Don't worry, Louis, Jack said. We'll come with you. What? Tim looked at Jack. It's exciting, Timbo, Jack said. Like going inside Stonehenge. Louis looked at Bessie. Would you go into one of Ha'amonga's standing stones? I don't know, Bessie said, looking over at the rock. Well, this feels like an invitation, though. Like the rock is waiting for you to enter. So I should go in, Louis asked. Bessie nodded. Louis stepped forward and walked up to the space in the rock. He half turned to the others. You coming too? Jack and Bessie nodded. Tim shrugged and looked away. Okay, Louis said, but when he peeked into the dark space inside the rock, he felt his throat tighten again. He could see the hole in the ground and the stairs that led down into the earth. He took a small breath and stepped inside. Cootie followed him and sat beside him. Louis turned to the others and waved for them to come in. Bessie came next, and then Jack. To make room for Tim, Louis had to step down onto the stairway. Hey, look, it's all lit up down there, Bessie said. There are little shelves dug into the wall with lanterns on them. That's good, Louis said. It'd be dark without those. If this rock closes up, we might be stuck in here forever, Tim said. One of us needs to stay outside so we can go and get help if it closes and doesn't open up again. Louis looked at Tim's serious face. He was glad Tim thought ahead like this. We could stick the wheelbarrow in the opening so it can't close up, Bessie said. The wheelbarrow was old, and Louis pictured it crushing with the pressure of the rock closing. It might break, he said. Tim, you wait outside while I see if my hand shuts and opens the rock again. Tim nodded and stepped back out onto Mr. Witheney's lawn. Louis's heart pounded in his ears. He breathed slowly out of his nose to calm himself the way Mr. Tamati had taught them. Then he reached out and lay his hand flat on the inside of the rock next to the jagged edges of the opening. The rock rumbled and the ground and stairway began to shake as the huge standing stone closed again. He could see Bessie and Jack's faces through the dim light from the lanterns on the stairway. They were staring at the place where the opening had been, as if willing it to reopen. Louis placed his hand back on the inside of the rock. Again, it grumbled and groaned as it split itself open. He sighed with relief. "Good to see you, Timbo," Jack said. Tim smiled. "Okay, we know we can get out again with Louis's hand for opening." "So," Bessie said, "the sunlight doesn't matter if you're inside the rock." "I was just imagining what it would be like if I never saw my family again," Jack said. "It was terrible." Tim stepped back inside Men Here. "Well, at least I wouldn't have to hear your mum asking you to do stuff over and over. Even from next door, I hear her calling out, 'Jack, did you hear me? Jack, I've asked you to do that 3 times. Jack smiled and patted Tim's back. "You'd miss that, Timbo. You'd miss hearing her yell down the hallway because it's such a happy sound." Okay with you guys to close the rock now?" Louis asked. His friends nodded. Louis placed his hand flat on the inside of the rock and it began to close. Let's have a sip of my tea. The walls of the stairway were rock, but they were dry, not like the wet, dripping walls of the tunnel up Awatū Mountain. The stairway wasn't deep. In fact, there were only 10 steps that led down into the passage, carved through rock, like a long corridor. Single file, they followed Louis along the underground passage until they came to another set of stairs leading upward. Louis faltered for a moment, standing at the bottom of the stairway. "Go up, Louis," Jack said. "Should be okay," Bessie said. "You have the hand for opening." Louis nodded and began to climb up the narrow stairway with Cootie and his friends behind him. At the top, Louis stepped into what seemed to be the inside of another huge rock. A shelf had been dug into the rock wall. On the shelf were a lantern and a large, thick book. The book cover was dark green with golden letters on it. Louis reached out to brush a thick layer of dust off it. The title was written in the same curved, looped letters that were on the tip of Men Here in Mr. Withany's garden. Louis squinted at the letters, trying to work out what they said. Beside him, Tim whispered, "It says, 'Stories of Old.'" Louis nodded. It had been the S that had confused him, the way its tail curled up and around the other words, like a vine. "No author's name on it," he whispered, lifting the hard, thick cover and gently opening the book. On the first page there was one sentence. "These are stories told by people long gone," Louis read. He turned another page. Peering over Louis's shoulder, Bessie read the title, "The Stones on the Field." The story underneath the title was short, only 1 paragraph. Below it was a painting of 2 standing stones in a field. Bessie continued to read. "On top of Lough Salt Hill, 2 giants tested their strength by seeing who could throw a stone furthest across the field below. Remember, what looks like a large stone to a giant is a huge rock to a human. The first giant lunged forward, sending his stone soaring ahead of him, and it landed with an earth-shattering thud, sinking a little into the soil of the field. The second giant threw his stone with all his might, and it landed a whisker's length in front of the first. This is how the standing stones came to be in the field below Lough Salt Hill. Bessie stopped and looked at Jack beside her. What a strange little story. Kind of explains how standing stones appeared, though, Jack said. Wonder if a giant threw men here from Awatiu Mountain, and that's how it ended up in Mr. W's garden. Louis ran his finger around the painting of the two standing stones. What's on the next page? Tim asked. Louis turned over a thick, yellowing paper page and read the next title. The Scottish and Irish Fairy Hurling Competition. He turned to his friends. What's hurling? Bessie, Jack and Tim shrugged. Louis kept reading. Once the Scottish fairies came to Ireland to compete in a most serious hurling game. Even though they joked and teased, they knew that whichever team lost the game would die. At the end of the game, there would be an Ireland without fairies or a Scotland without fairies. After a joyous first half with much comedy, the players became fierce. Now they were playing for their lives. Legend has it that the Scots won, and fairies have not been seen in Ireland for over 100 years. Louis turned to his friends. What kind of a game is that? That's sad, Jack said. They wiped out the Irish fairies. It's just a story, Jack, Tim said. I don't like it, Louis said. I'm not reading another one. Let's look outside, Jack suggested. Louis nodded. He could sense Tim wanted to say something. He'd want to inspect the surroundings from a safe distance first, but there was no hole in the rock to peek through. Louis looked at Tim. Tim looked at Bessie. We've come all this way, Bessie said. Tim nodded. Louis placed his hand flat on the inside of the huge rock, and a second later it began to rumble again and open. The 4 Toohey Street kids stayed very still. Louis wondered whether their stomachs felt a bit sick like his did. What if there was something dangerous out there? It was too late now. The rock groaned open, and in front of them was a wide field with rocky hills in the background. There was no one to be seen. Down one end of the field was a circle of huge rocks. A standing stone circle, Louis whispered, like Stonehenge. Jack poked his head out of the opening. No one around. Let's go and look at it. He stepped out of the opening onto the grass, and the others followed him. We just have to remember this standing stone is the one that takes us back, Tim said. I'll remember, Louis said. The circle of standing stones is down that end, and ours is here, all by itself. Tim nodded. He swept his hair away from his eyes. Those stories in that book. I like facts more than made-up stories. I like reading about things that are real. I know, Louis said. Once he'd heard Mr. Tamati tell Tim that he'd want Tim around if there was ever an emergency, because Tim was a clear thinker and he'd know what to do. The standing stones were different shapes and sizes and formed a complete circle. Inside the circle, a small rectangle seemed to have been burnt into the grass. 2 small sticks were wedged firmly into the ground at both ends of the rectangle. The friends stood just outside the circle of towering rocks while Cootie walked around sniffing each stone before squatting down beside one. No, Cootie! Louis cried, but it was too late. Cootie's urine splattered up the side of the rock. What if she made that rock open, Jack said, because she has the wee for opening? They laughed. Louis looked up at the standing stones. Just last night I was looking at pictures of these online. Now, where a loud thud interrupted Louis, then a huge rock flew from the top of a hill towards the centre of the field. The gigantic rock landed upright and the earth shook. Louis grabbed onto the standing stone beside him and watched the large rock sink into the earth a little so that it stood firm and straight. Looking up to where the rock had come from, he saw two huge men in kilts standing on a hill. So he saw two huge men in kilts, which are the Scottish kind of skirt type things that men wear. They're like a wraparound skirt. And they were standing on the hill. Giants, Jack said, get behind the rocks. Above, a Scottish voice boomed. My turn. One of the giant men bent down and picked up a long, thick rock that lay on the ground. As he leant over, Louis saw that he wore a red tartan hat. The giant lifted the rock above his head and hurled it through the air. The earth shook again with the weight of the rock forcing itself into the ground. Now, both rocks stood upright. Mine went further, the giant who'd just thrown said in a Scottish accent. We'll do it again, the other giant cried, just to be sure. He had an Irish accent, just like Miss Brennan's. It's sure as the nose on my face, the Scottish giant protested. Well, you've a crooked nose, the Irish giant boomed. I don't trust it. There are no more rocks on this hill, the Scottish giant said. Let's go to the next hill along if you're really sure you want to lose again. He turned and disappeared down the other side of the hill. The Irish giant laughed, and the standing stone Louis leant against vibrated with the sound. We'll see who loses this one, he called after the Scots giant. He turned his back to the field below, where the Toy Street kids hid behind the circle of stones, and then he was gone. That was the story in the book, Bessie said in a half whisper. Tim nodded, and now there are two more standing stones in the field thrown by giants. So that's Lough Salt Hill, Bessie said, where the giants were. What's this then? Jack stepped inside the circle and placed one foot in between the two sticks at one end of the rectangle. It's sort of like a miniature soccer. Get your great big foot off our hurling pitch, a voice cried. Jack lifted his foot and it hovered above the rectangle as he looked around him. That's right, the voice continued. Now stay off it. Louis looked around. The words seemed to be coming from the rock on the other side of the circle. He squinted and pointed at it. Look, he whispered. On a narrow shelf on the rock, a bunch of tiny people huddled. One of them stepped forward. We'd like to continue with our game, he said, his tiny turned-up nose barely visible under his mop of red hair. He wore a red tartan hat and kilt, miniature versions of what the Scottish giant had worn. He continued to speak. We stopped when we heard the rock open. Then we realised you were only human children. But the giants came, so we had to wait. Now we'd like to play, if you'd be so polite as to step off our field. Jack nodded and lifted his hovering foot off the rectangle. He looked at Louis, Bessie and Tim and shrugged. Cootie watched the tiny people with interest. The little people stepped off the ledge of rock and fluttered down onto the rectangle of grass. Each of them carried a small stick. They've got wings, Bessie whispered. Aye, we have, lass, said another small person in an Irish accent, wearing a blue kilt and a hat. We're fairies, Louis interrupted. He turned to his friends. Mr. W. said, His wife thought the standing stone was put there by fairies. She was Irish. Aye, well, she'd be right then, another fairy dressed in blue said. He smiled. And if she's Irish, she can't help but be right. The other fairies laughed. Aye, but you do need a Scotsman to be absolutely sure of the truth, a fairy in red cried. The fairies laughed again. Is the Irish team in blue? Bessie asked. Aye, a fairy in red replied, pushing his blonde hair under his hat. And we Scots are in red. Why don't girls play this game? Bessie asked. Well, they do, lass, said an Irish fairy, but it's called Carmagie, and it's almost the same as hurling. The girls' game is tomorrow, and you're welcome to come and watch. Let's begin, another Irish fairy called, or the sun will hit the rock before we know it. Louis wondered what he meant by that. Was there another rock that needed sunlight on its tip for some reason? Did the fairies have to stop playing and go home then? The two teams spread out across the rectangle on the field, and then a fairy in blue on the edge of the rectangle threw a tiny ball into the middle, which set the game in motion. The fairies ran, carrying their sticks to whack at the ball on the ground. One caught it in midair with his hand and began to run, but another ran into him, so the ball flew out of his hand and sailed through the air. Bessie leant over to Louis. The stories we read from that book are coming to life out here. This is the other story we read. And I don't want to watch it end because the Irish fairies lose and then they die. The Irish fairy who had the ball in his hand came to an abrupt standstill. He held up his other hand to stop the game. Time, he called. Stop the game. When everyone was still, he turned and looked up at Bessie. Did you see the Irish fairies die? Bessie looked at the fairies' solemn faces. She nodded. There was complete silence on the field. Then the fairies began to laugh. Some of them held their stomachs and bellowed with laughter. Bessie, Louis, Tim and Jack looked at each other. How could they find this so funny? Where did you hear this? One of the Irish fairies asked, tilting his head backwards to look up at them. It's in the book, Louis said. The Stories of Old book, inside that standing stone over there. He pointed to the rock with the underground passage. Another round of laughing began. When the fairies finally quietened, the one with the ball in his hand looked up at them. You can't believe everything you read, just as you can't always believe what people say. Stories are just made up by people. A younger Irish fairy came forward. He looked as if he was a teenager. How do we know it's not true? It's just a game, an older Irish fairy said. How can it make us all die? What if the book speaks the truth? The younger fairy asked. Many books speak the truth, and ignoring the truth is foolish. Listen, young Paddy. It's just a funny old story that someone made up, another Irish fairy said. Now let's get back to the game. A fairy with a short black beard threw the ball in from the outside again, and an Irish fairy hit it hard to another, who caught it and hit it so hard that it flew through the sticks at the end of the rectangle. Goal! He screamed. The Irish team leapt in the air, hugging and laughing. One fairy in blue flew up and hovered above the rest. No flying, one of the Scottish fairies cried. Remember the rules. We stay on the ground for the game, because flying gives us an advantage. The fairy in the air immediately dropped to the ground, and the game continued. Louis noticed that the young Irish fairy didn't smile at the goal. He looked away at the standing stone they'd come through. His mouth twisted as if trying to make sense of something. Jack's voice interrupted Louis's thoughts. We should ask Mr. Tamati if we can do hurling at school. Have to find out the rules, Tim said. I can't work them out. We could look on the internet, Jack said. People might have filmed games. Tim smiled. You'll be even more Irish, Jack, if you learn how to hurl. Jack grinned back at his friend. I will indeed, lad, he said in an Irish accent. Louis smiled, but he couldn't get the young fairy, Paddy, out of his mind. As the game continued, he watched Paddy run, catch the ball and tackle the ball off others with his stick. Paddy's face was red as he sprinted after the ball and other players, but for all his effort, the Scots were scoring the goals. Paddy kept looking over at the large standing stone that Louis and his friends had come through. Louis followed Paddy's anxious gaze. What was the young fairy checking on? Time's almost up, one of the Scottish team cried. Sun's on the top of the rock. Not quite, yelled a Scottish fairy as he sped past with an Irish fairy smacking the ball with his stick. As he sped past an Irish fairy smacking the ball with his stick so that it flew past the goalkeeper and into the goal. The Scottish team leapt in the air and threw their sticks down as they ran to each other, whooping with joy. They're still here, Tim said, turning to his friends. The Irish haven't died. Bessie smiled. A happy ending, thank goodness, not like the one in the story. Good, Louis said. That would have been a terrible ending to the game. Let's go now before the sun moves off that rock, in case it only opens from the outside if the sun's still on it. Anyway, I'm meant to be pruning trees for Mr. W. I don't want him to think I'm mucking around. As they walked towards the rock, Jack said, I'm going to go on the internet and find out more about hurling. Want to come too, Tim and Bessie? Tim nodded, but Bessie shook her head. I'd better go and help Grandad cook dinner. He sometimes doesn't notice things. Yesterday, he put a tea towel on a hot element, and luckily we smelt it burning before it caught fire. Let's do it after dinner, Tim said. Then you and Louis can both come. Okay, Bessie said. I want to find out how different the girls' game is. What was it called? Carnegie, Tim said. Bessie nodded. I want to find out about Carnegie. Hey, funny humans, one of the Scottish fairies called. Thank you for watching. Aye, another Scottish fairy cried, for watching the best team win. The Irish fairies laughed, and one of them called out, wait till next year when we beat you. We'll come back for that game, Jack said. You're welcome, one of the Irish fairies said. You're large, clumsy things, and your dog's strange looking, but you're always welcome. Louis noticed Paddy was smiling now. The story hadn't come true, and now Paddy, the young Irish fairy, was relaxed and laughing with the rest of the fairies. We'll see you then, Louis said, turning away. They had to get to that rock before the sun disappeared from its tip, and he had to get back to Mr. W's to keep working. The fairies rose into the air, their sticks in their hands. The Scottish fairies flew off to the left, as Louis walked back to the standing stone with Curdie and his friends. They flew slowly, chatting and laughing. Turning to the right, Louis saw the Irish fairies also moving slowly and chatting. But they were disappearing, wing by wing, tiny hats and kilts becoming invisible, and legs dissolving into the air. He stopped walking. The Scottish fairies on the left were still there, noisily making their way back to Scotland. Look, Louis said to his friends, the story was true. They're disappearing, Tim said. It was as if someone was erasing something drawn in pencil. They were being rubbed out. The 4 Tui Street kids stood still, watching as each fairy disappeared. Let's go, Louis said. He looked at the rock ahead of them. A glimmer of sunlight was still on its tip. We'd better run. They rushed towards the standing stone. Curdie ahead of them. Curdie ran ahead of them, then sat whimpering beside the huge rock. Louis reached down to pat her and placed his other hand on the rock, which rumbled like thunder, splitting open before them. That evening, no one was outside playing soccer or skateboarding. Louis wondered if they were working on their stories. He'd worked for 2 more hours at Mr. Withany's, then rushed his dinner so that he could get to Jack's. Jack's dad greeted Louis at the front door. Aroha, Jack's little sister, was beside him, with her thumb in her mouth and holding a book. Her eyelids were droopy. "Come on in, Louis," Jack's dad said. "Aroha and I are just going to read a book, aren't we, Aroha?" Aroha nodded. Puka puka time. She kept her thumb in her mouth while she spoke. "Jack's got the laptop on the table," her dad said, turning away to walk down the hall. "Go on in and join him and Bessie." "And Tim," Aroha added. "You forgot Tim." "Yes, of course. Tim too. Silly me." Aroha giggled. "You're a silly father," she said, as she followed her dad down the hallway to her room. Louis watched them for a moment. He had no memory of a father in his life, and it felt like he was discovering something new whenever he watched fathers with their children. At the dining room table, Jack, Tim and Bessie sat around a laptop. They were watching a video clip of a hurling game. Louis pulled a chair over to sit next to them. "Louis," Jack said, "a hurling ball is called a slyatar, and the stick's called a hurley." Louis nodded. "No one's outside playing soccer tonight." "Terry's got her nationals training tonight," Tim said, "and Ella's little stepsisters are in a school concert, so she went to that. And Harry and Gemma might be working on their stories. Bet Lucy's working on her story." Bessie turned to Louis. "Wouldn't feel right to play soccer and have fun anyway when a whole team of fairies just died?" Louis nodded. "Can't stop thinking about it." Tim and Jack turned away from the screen and looked at Louis. "I can't either," Jack said. "Just so cruel," Tim interrupted. "What's cruel?" Jack's mum said, coming into the kitchen with Edmund, their dog, breathing heavily beside her. Jack turned and reached down to stroke Edmund. "The way you take Edmund for such long walks when he's old is cruel." "He loves it," Jack's mum said. "He'd be sad if I left him behind." "But that's not what you were talking about. Tell me what's cruel." "We read a story with a cruel ending," Tim said. "Ah, what's the story?" Jack's mum asked. It's about an Irish and Scottish hurling competition," Jack said. "Right," Jack's mum said. "Hang on, I'll just give Edmund some water." "Mum," Jack said, "remember how Uncle Ehire went to England and showed us those photos of Stonehenge?" Jack's mum nodded. "Yeah, I do. I remember thinking it looked magical, and it made me think of the standing stones here in Aotearoa, the ones my grandparents used to talk about, which are pretty magical too." Jack's eyes widened, and he looked at Bessie, Louis and Tim, while his mother turned away and picked up a bowl from a mat on the floor. The mat had dog's paws printed on it. Jack's mum filled the bowl with water at the sink. "Here you go, Edmund," she said, sploshing a bit of water on the mat as she placed it back down. "There are other standing stones in New Zealand?" Jack asked. His mum straightened up. "Yeah, there's quite a few." "What do you mean by other, Jack? Have you seen one?" Jack nodded. "In Mr. Withany's garden, where Louis works." His mum looked at Louis and smiled. "Jack mentioned you were working there, Louis. I'm glad. I've chatted with Mr. Withany over the years and often wondered whether he could do with some help." "I like it," Louis said. "Good," Jack's mum said. "I can show you guys an old stone circle in Aotearoa now if you want me to. Type in Waitapu Standing Stone Circle, Jack." Jack typed in the words and a list of websites appeared. He clicked on a few. One showed pictures of large rocks shaped like shark fins and explained that the Waitapu Standing Stone Circle was designed to help measure time and the movements of the stars and the sun. Another website showed the nearby Puketapu Hill with many large stones scattered on it. There were mounds of stones too, like tiny stone hills. "Those little hills made out of stones are called cairns," Jack's mother said. "Apparently people built them in memory of someone or something special." Anyway, I'll leave you to keep looking while I go and give Aroha a kiss goodnight. The next day, at school, Mr. Tamati stapled artwork to the wall while Ms. Brennan asked if any students needed to discuss any problems they were having with their stories. A few people put their hands up and she made her way over to them, talking quietly with them about what they were writing. Louis looked out the window at Cloudbird, who seemed to be staring back at him. He imagined waving at Cloudbird and smiled briefly at the thought of Cloudbird lifting his wing to wave back. Then he thought of his story and decided to stop messing around. He was having a problem with his story. In fact, he was having a problem with all stories, really. Why do people write stories with sad endings? He looked at Miss Brennan, who was moving between the clusters of desks and getting nearer to him. She stopped beside his desk and looked out the window at Cloudbird. "He's a good friend to you, that bird," she said. "Does he follow you everywhere?" "Not everywhere," Louis answered. "He doesn't come into our house. I don't think he likes being inside." "That makes sense," Miss Brennan said. "He's a bird after all." "He did come in the tunnel up Awatiu Mountain, though," Jack said, turning around from his desk in front. "True," Louis said, nodding. "Right, let's get back to stories," Miss Brennan said. "Any problems with your story, Louis?" Louis nodded, twirling his pencil between his fingers. "Want to tell me about it?" Louis didn't look up. "I don't like how stories sometimes have sad endings," he whispered. Miss Brennan's green eyes moved from Louis to the obstacle course. "I need a stretch, Louis. Want to come outside and do a bit of dangling from monkey bars with me? We can talk about endings out there." Louis nodded and stood up slowly. Miss Brennan went over to Mr. Tamati, who was standing on a chair so he could staple higher up the wall. She spoke quietly to him, and Mr. Tamati nodded before turning back to the wall with his staple gun. Outside, Miss Brennan reached up for a monkey bar and swung her legs up around another bar, then hung upside down. "Ah, it's good to stretch, Louis, especially if we're a bit tense or worried. You could try it. Go on, have a go." Louis moved a few bars away from Miss Brennan. Copying her, he hung upside down so that they were facing each other. It was strange looking at her face upside down. "Tell me about endings, Louis," Miss Brennan said. "Why are they troubling you?" Louis took a deep breath and swung himself a little. "People sometimes die, Miss Brennan, or disappear forever." Miss Brennan began to swing too and said, "Shall we see if we can high-five each other, Louis?" Louis swung with more energy and clapped his hands against Miss Brennan's. She laughed and he smiled back at her. Then Miss Brennan looked straight up at him with her upside-down green eyes. "Let's jump down, Louis. I'm going to show you something." Louis thudded to the ground and Cloudbird flew down to perch on his shoulder. Unlike Louis, Miss Brennan unfurled herself like a ballet dancer and then reached her hand up to the first monkey bar in the row. "This is the beginning of the story, Louis." Louis nodded. "We move onward, Louis," Miss Brennan continued, reaching for the next bar with her other hand. "But sometimes we slip." She let one hand slip off so that only the other hand was holding on. "Now, Louis, in real life, some people slip right off. It might be earlier on in the story, or it might be in the middle, or it might be at the end. We can't do anything about real life stories. Sometimes they are terribly painful." "You mean like..." Louis swallowed and reached up to stroke Cloudbird's neck on his shoulder. "You mean like my dad dying?" "Yes, Louis." And how Mr. Tamati won't be my teacher anymore?" "Yes, Louis." and it's sad when people leave our real life story. But we continue to swing to the next bar and the next bar because our story continues. We don't know what exciting things might be ahead in our own story because it's our life story. Miss Brennan swung from one bar to another, then landed on the rubber matting so softly it was like a feather touching the ground. Your turn now, Miss Brennan said. Can you do the whole row of monkey bars? Yep. Louis jumped up to the first bar and swung forward, one bar after the other. You can do what you like with made-up stories, Louis, Miss Brennan said. You can choose to stop in the middle of the excitement, or you can continue to the end. You can make the ending happy or sad. It's your story, Louis, just like it's your life story, your journey on the monkey bars. What if it's already written? Louis asked, reaching the last bar and landing with a thud on the mat. What if someone else wrote it and the ending's bad? Then change it, Louis, Miss Brennan said. Rewrite the ending. Lots of people do that. Look at all the different versions of fairy tales. Rewrite the story that's troubling you so much, Louis. Louis nodded. Okay. Right. Well, let's go back into class and get writing. Miss Brennan tilted her head from side to side, stretching her neck. But it was good to hang upside down for a while, wasn't it? That afternoon, Louis left school with a piece of paper, his pen, and a glue stick tucked into his jacket pocket. As he walked home, Jack, Tim, and Bessie discussed the rules of Carnegie and hurling. The other Tui Street kids asked questions, but it soon became clear that no one really felt sure about the rules. Bet Miss Brennan knows about the game, Terry said. She's Irish. Let's ask her tomorrow and we'll write down the rules. We need sticks and a ball, though, Tim said. We've got long pieces of wood underneath our deck, Lucy said. They're actually leftover fence posts that Mum and Dad didn't need. And we've got an old hockey ball we could use, Harry said. Mum used to play hockey. When Louis turned to go through Mr. Withany's gate, he saw Terry slow down to walk beside Lucy. Through all the goodbyes, Louis heard Terry say, fence post, to Lucy. It occurred to Louis that Terry would probably be very good at hurling because she was so good at soccer. She was only 12, but she played for the under-15 national girls team and had gone to Japan for a tournament not long ago. Terry waved as she passed him. You'd be good at hurling, he said to her. We could all give it a try, Terry answered. With my fence posts, Lucy said, but not tonight because our last story is due tomorrow. Louis nodded. He didn't think anyone would be playing anything tonight with stories to finish. See you tomorrow, he said, turning to make his way over the pebbled pathway down to Mr. Withany's house. Mr. Withany had baked hokey pokey muffins. They were laid out on a cooling rack on his kitchen bench. Ever tried them before? He asked Louis. Never, Louis said. I've only eaten hokey pokey ice cream. Well, that's pretty much what these are, Mr. Withany said. I just mixed half a tub of hokey pokey ice cream with flour and baking powder, and here they are. Louis looked at Mr. Withany's face. He wasn't sure whether to believe him because he was smiling, but then he always smiled at Louis. Mr. Withany laughed. You don't know whether I'm telling the truth, I can see. Help yourself to one and fill yourself a jug of water. Louis bit into the muffin. It smelt good and tasted even better. So what do you think, Mr. Withany asked, ice cream or not? Tastes like ice cream, Louis said. You were telling the truth. I do like to tell the truth, Louis, Mr. W said. It just makes me feel better about things if I know I'm being honest. Mr. W, I don't think I'll be able to sit down with you to eat these today, Louis said. I've got to hand in my last hero's journey story tomorrow, so I better start work straight away. Mr. Withany smiled. And look, you're being honest with me, he said. Well done, young Louis. Take another muffin with you, and don't forget the jug of water. Louis felt a little guilty as he made his way towards Menhir. He hadn't been completely honest. He was going to work, and he did have his story to complete afterwards, so that was the truth. He just had something else he had to do first. Placing the tray with the muffin and jug of water on the grass near Menhir, Louis looked up at Cloudbird in the blossoming plum tree. Don't eat my muffin, okay? He called up to him. Cloudbird chortled back at him, sticking his beak into a blossom. Louis pushed the thin branches in front of Menhir to the side, and there was Cootie, looking very small, sitting beside the huge standing stone. How did you get here? Louis asked. You must have sneaked in behind me through the gate. He leant down to pat Cootie's head. How did none of us see you? Standing up, he checked the pen, paper and the glue were still in his pocket. The sunlight was almost on top of Menhir. Louis waited until it was directly on the top, on the very tip. Then, taking a deep breath, he placed his hand on the rock. The familiar tingle spread through his hand and up his arm. The rock began to split apart. When the gap was wide enough, Louis slid inside the rock. Cootie stood up to follow him. No, Cootie, you can't come, Louis said. She stood still, looking at him. Stay, Cootie, stay, Louis said. He placed his hand on the inside of the rock, but just as it started to close, Cootie darted in. Louis walked down the stairs, lit up by lanterns, and made his way along the underground passage. Then straight up the stairs that led to the inside of the other standing stone. The book on the shelf was closed, exactly the way they'd left it. Lantern light flickered across the book's green cover so that the title, Stories of Old, looked as though it was moving. The strange, loopy S quivered in the lantern light. Louis swallowed. His mouth was dry. He needed Mr. Withany's jug of water. Beside him, Cootie leant into his leg, and he reached down to rub her behind the ears. He was glad she'd come. He straightened up and took the square of paper and the glue stick out of his pocket, then stepped up to the shelf, and trying not to look at the quivering title, he lifted the cover. He didn't look at the stones on the field story about the giants competing to throw stones the furthest. He flicked straight to the next story, the Scottish and Irish fairy hurling competition. Quickly, he pasted glue over the piece of paper he'd pulled from his pocket and smoothed it over the story. Now he began to write his version of the story on his piece of paper that was stuck onto the page. In his version, the Scottish still won, but all of the fairies flew home safely, knowing they'd come back to compete again the following year. When he'd finished writing, he closed the book. It's done now, he thought. The fairies are all okay. An image of the younger fairy, Paddy, laughing and joking, filled Louis's mind, and he turned away smiling. Now, back to Mr. W's. On the top step down to the passage, Louis stopped and looked back. Something had caught his eye. Probably the lantern flickering, he thought. Taking another step down, he stopped again. Something was moving on the bookshelf. He turned to look. The paper he'd glued on His new version of the story was peeling away from the page. It rose completely off the book and dropped to the floor. Cootie growled. The book snapped shut. Louis looked around him. There was no one here except him and Cootie. His throat felt tight again and he was struggling to swallow. He wanted to run down the stairs, along the corridor, back up the stairs to Men Here and back to Mr. W's. But he looked at his new version of the story lying on the rock floor, and Miss Brennan's words came back to him. Rewrite the story that's troubling you so much. He thought again of Paddy, the younger fairy, and turned back up the stairs. Sometimes old stories just have to change, he thought. He bent down to pick up his piece of paper. The book cover seemed heavier. With effort, Louis pushed it open and flattened it back against the rock shelf. Flicking back to the right page, he smoothed his story over the top of the old story again and pressed down hard to make sure it was firmly stuck to the page. Stepping away, he watched the page. This time, his piece of paper didn't peel off slowly. Instead, it pulled clear away and fell to the floor again. The book slammed shut. Now, Cootie stood and growled, baring her teeth. Louis stared at the paper by his feet. His plan hadn't worked. He pulled his pen out of his pocket. He could cross out the bits that mentioned fairies dying, he thought, and then he could get out of this strange rock, away from these old stories that made him so uncomfortable. He walked over to the book, lifted the unwilling cover, and held it flat against the shelf with his elbow. Stay there, he muttered to the book as he flicked over to the right page again. He quickly scanned the first 2 sentences in the story. Once the Scottish fairies came to Ireland to compete in a most serious hurling game, even though they joked and teased, they knew that whichever team lost, the game would die. Louis put a line through the last 2 words and squeezed in a new ending to the sentence. Now the sentence was, they knew that whichever team lost the game would have to practice harder for next year's competition. He scanned the next few lines. At the end of the game, there would be an Ireland without fairies or a Scotland without fairies. Louis crossed it out and wrote, at the end of the game, one team would be happy and the other team would be frustrated. It was hard to squeeze it all in neatly, but he seemed to be managing, and he was sure it was clear enough for someone to read. Louis read the next part. After a joyous first half with much comedy, the players became fierce. Now they were playing for their lives. Legend has it that the Scots won, and fairies have not been seen in Ireland for over 100 years. Louis crossed out for their lives and replaced it with now they were playing to win. He then crossed out the second part of the next sentence so that it was now legend has it that the Scots won and the Irish fairies went home vowing to practice all year so that they could win the next competition. Louis shut the book. There, he'd rewritten it. Now he could go home. Come on, Cootie, let's go, he said. This time, though, before he turned away, the book itself lifted off the shelf and hovered in front of Louis. A hissing sound came from inside its covers. The book flicked open at the page Louis had written on and snapped shut, then opened again, only to snap shut once more, like a mouth trying to speak. Cootie began to bark. Louis stepped back. He turned to run down the steps, calling to Cootie, but the book flew in front of him. A hissing sound came from inside its covers. The book flew in front of him, throwing itself down the stairway, scraping Louis's rewritten page across the rocks steps. the rock steps. The book rose and flew in front of Louis's face, as if trying to say something. It opened and shut, then hurled itself back down the stairs, scratching the page across the rock steps again. "Stop doing that," Louis yelled. "Stop it! You're ruining it!" The book didn't stop. It soared up in front of Louis's face, opening and shutting as if silently shouting at him, then lurched back to scrape the page against each step. Standing beside Louis, Cootie began to howl. "Oh! You'll destroy the story," Louis yelled. If the book scraped off the new words so no one could read them, would that mean the Irish fairies were going to die? Louis had to know whether his new story had worked. He ran to place his hand on the inside of the rock wall. The rock pulled itself apart and Louis pushed through, sprinting to the circle of standing stones across the field with Cootie by his side. Were the fairies playing? They should be, because he'd just been reading their story. Louis could hear the blood pounding in his head, but he could also hear something behind him. Glancing back, he saw the book following him, opening and shutting, as if calling to him. He turned back towards the stone circle. "Run," he yelled to himself and Cootie, "run!" The book tore ahead of him, slamming itself against one of the standing stones, so that the page he'd written on banged hard against the rock. "Stop it!" Louis yelled. "They'll all die!" He almost fell into the stone circle, clutching at the rough rock under his hands. He stared down at the rectangle. Where were the fairies? He'd just read their story. They should be there. From a ledge on one of the standing stones, an Irish fairy in blue tartan flew out into the middle of the circle. "You've interrupted our game," he said to Louis. It was the younger fairy, Paddy. Louis smiled with relief. "I'm just here to watch it. Sorry, please let me watch." He could see the other Scottish and Irish fairies huddled on the ledge behind Paddy. "You're Paddy, aren't you?" "Well, how did you know that?" The young Irish fairy's eyes were wide. They don't remember, Louis thought. Each time the story is told, it's a whole new beginning for them. So they keep repeating the ending where they die. Well, that's not going to happen anymore. As if aware of Louis's thoughts, the book flew up above the circle and slammed down on a rock. The ground vibrated under Louis's feet and Cootie began to bark again. Paddy flew back to the ledge to huddle with the other fairies. "Stop it!" Louis yelled at the book, but it flew above the circle and hovered as if preparing for attack. "Listen," Louis said to the fairies, "you have to keep playing. Do as the story says, until the sun hits the rock. The Irish fairies die at the end of the story. I wrote a new ending, and that book's trying to scratch out my words. You play, and I'll try to stop the book." One of the Scottish fairies stepped forward on the ledge. "That's complete rubbish," he said. "They're stories. They're not true, you know." "Please," Louis said, "I'm trying to help you." The book crashed down onto the rock where the fairies were hiding, and they shrank back in fear. Cootie began to howl again. The book rose up again. "Trust me," Louis shouted over Cootie. "We can't let the stories of old book scrape off my writing. Not if you want to live." Paddy stepped forward. "I've never liked that book. That story says that we Irish fairies die." "So keep playing," Louis said. "You haven't got much longer." A Scottish fairy looked over at the large standing stone Louis had come from. "When the sun hits the top of the rock, our game is over." "Yep, and it's nearly there. So please, just play and get this game finished while I try to stop the book from destroying my ending," Louis said. The fairies flew down to the rectangle and began to play. This time, instead of watching the game, Louis looked frantically around him. There were small stones on the grass. Maybe he could throw them at the book each time it hurled itself downward. Picking up a handful of stones, Louis heard the Scottish fairies cheering and laughing. They were winning just as the story said they would. Up above, the book opened and shut, poised for action. When it suddenly plummeted down towards a rock, Louis threw a stone at the cover. It bounced off. and the book flinched and half closed so that it landed on its cover on the rock. Rising high again, it immediately dropped down, page wide open, to slam against the rock. As it hurtled past him, Louis threw another stone, and once more the book half shut to protect itself. Louis looked over at the rock. The sun was almost on it. The book soared up again. This time, as it lowered, it darted from side to side like a soccer player, dodging tackles. Louis aimed, watching the movements closely. He wasn't even sure if his rewritten bits were still on the page. They might have been scraped off by now. The stone was firm in his fingers. The book was nearer now. He threw the stone hard at the book, but the book swung away. "No!" Louis yelled. He watched the book hurtling down to slam against the rock. Just as it was about to hit, Cootie ran past Louis and leapt up, catching the book in her mouth. A cheer rang out from the fairies on the hurling pitch. "Game over!" one of them yelled. Louis looked over at the rock. The sun was on it. He'd better get moving. The game was over, and the book was firmly clenched between Cootie's jaws. He watched the fairies shaking hands and laughing and joking about next year's competition and how the Irish had better start practicing. Paddy looked up at him. "What's going to happen?" he asked. "I'm not sure," Louis said. He saw Paddy's face crease with worry. "I'm sorry," Louis said. "I tried." "Ah, stop fussing, Paddy," one of the Irish fairies said. "It's only a story." Paddy looked at Louis. Thank you for trying," he said. Louis nodded back at him. He couldn't think of what to say. The fairies joked and chatted. The Scottish fairies flew off to the left, while the Irish fairies flew off to the right, their hurley sticks in their hands. Louis knew he should be making his way to the rock before the sun slid off it, but he had to see whether the Irish fairies disappeared again. There was a chance his rewriting had worked. The Irish fairies' laughter echoed through the late afternoon air. Paddy gave Louis a small, uncertain wave. Louis waved back. At any moment now, Louis knew they could start to disappear. He closed his eyes and opened them again. The Irish fairies were still there. Paddy was still waving from further in the distance. Louis closed and opened his eyes again. They were still there, smaller now, like flying insects on the horizon. "We're still here!" Paddy cried. "You are!" Louis called back. "We're alive!" Paddy cried. "We're alive!" Louis grinned. "Yes, it's worked!" he cried, jumping up and down in the air. He and Cootie began to run back to the rock. The sun had almost disappeared from its tip. Louis placed his hand on the hard, rough stone, and it trembled beneath him. The familiar tingling spread up his arm. He stumbled through the opening. "Come on, Cootie," he said. "Let's put that book back and go home." The lantern flickered over the empty shelf. Louis bent down and gently took the book from Cootie's mouth. He flicked through the first few pages until he found the Scottish and Irish fairy hurling competition. His eyes flew across the sentences. There were scrapes and marks all over it, and some bits were slightly torn, but Louis's rewritten bits could still be seen, and the crossed out bits were still crossed out. Louis breathed out slowly and closed the book, putting it back on the shelf. "I had to change that story," he said to the book. It lay there, unmoving, and for a fleeting moment Louis felt sorry for it. It must be hard to have someone insist that your story be rewritten. He reached out and patted the green and gold cover. Perhaps the book accepted defeat. Louis turned to Cootie. "Let's go, girl." And that's the end of part 2, the challenge, and I will read the return, part 3, the return to you, very soon. See you soon.